especially this part of Colorado, over the last 4 or 5 months than I have in DC. And that's because this is a very important state from a national perspective. And it's a very important state to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And the U.S. Chamber is the largest trade association in the country, which I'm pretty sure that makes it in the world. And I say that only from a standpoint of we represent businesses of all sizes and sectors and regions. And that means that we represent energy companies from the entire swath, from your renewable companies to your utilities, to your oil and gas companies, coal companies, and some of the really, really crazy innovation companies that aren't really sure what they're doing yet. And that makes for interesting discussion sometimes because, as you can probably imagine, they don't always see eye to eye on many things. Today's focus is largely oil and gas, but I think the marketing information discussed traditional energy. And I'm going to try and give you a little bit of a national perspective and specifically where Colorado fits into that and why I and the U.S. Chamber think Colorado is so important and what is happening here right now is so important. So with that, we'll get into a few slides. Right now, this is a sort of scene setter to begin with. Right now, this is globally, demand is expected to increase for energy by about 53% between now and 2035. And that's important because, as you see the next line, almost all of that demand is coming from developing nations. It's not coming from the US or Europe or developed nations in Japan. It's coming from places especially like China, India, and the Middle Eastern countries. And that's important because their motivations for where and how they get energy are distinctly different than how developed nations at least have communicated our priorities are vis-a-vis environmental standards. We expect, the International Energy Agency expects electricity demand to increase by 76%, so nearly doubling between now and 2035. And a very important point, if you look around the world, 1.6 billion, with a B, people don't have access to electricity. There's no other single statistical corollary besides potable water to quality of life than having access to electricity. And this is important because those developing nations where this demand is growing, this is what motivates their governments and their leaders, is bringing electricity to the masses. It's not necessarily we want, the newest bells and whistles that have zero emissions. As you can see when it comes to China, their number one goal over the last 20 years has been to provide enough electricity to feed a growing economy. And the same can be said for India, for large swaths of Central America, Sub-Saharan Africa. And so when we go to these climate negotiations every year, and the next one will be pretty important because the world will be sort of deciding on what greenhouse gas targets we may or may not be looking at post-Kyoto. This is important to keep in mind, is that this is what's motivating those countries, because they know that those people, those 1.6 billion people, may very well be burning cattle dung in order to heat buckets of water to feed their family. It means they don't have access to reliable cooling for medicine, or frankly, cooling when it's ridiculously hot in the summertime, or warmth when it's ridiculously cold in the wintertime. They're forced to burn wood and coal, raw coal. And that is a much greater impact to health than, frankly, effluent air emissions. Now, the same entity that makes these projections suggests that it's going to be $38 trillion in order to meet that demand. And that also is important because we take it kind of for granted. In our country, we rely on, for the most part, private, publicly owned utilities to make these investments. Now, obviously, we pay our utility bills, and depending upon what kind of state you live in, whether it's regulated or deregulated, we are providing the money to our utilities in order to make the investments to meet demand going forward. But in the vast majority of the rest of the world, those utilities are owned by the state. They're owned by the country. And so if the federal government doesn't have the money to make the investment, those investments don't happen. And the fact of the matter is, whether you like it or not, whether it's right or whether it's wrong, coal provides the most efficient and cheapest source of electricity to the masses around the world. And it will continue for some time. Sometime in the next year or two, it's projected that coal will overtake oil as the largest single source of energy around the world. And that's because, again, countries are trying to bring large amounts of electricity to large amounts of people all over the countryside. And then one point that I always try to make from a scene setter standpoint is that if you look at all the oil and gas reserves around the world, 90% of them are controlled by state-owned companies, by companies that are run by governments, companies that answer to people like Vladimir Putin or the folks, the government in Venezuela, people that we don't necessarily see eye to eye on many times. And you know, anytime gasoline prices spike, the folks in DC, the members of Congress that we elect, love to haul up the CEOs of the large oil and gas companies in this country and, you know, wag their finger at them and say, why are you gouging our customers? You know, big oil this, big oil that. But at the end of the day, they represent about 8% of the world's oil reserves. They are not big oil. It's those state-owned oil companies that they are having to compete against around the world for those same reserves. And those companies are companies, the people that we generally hear about or consider big oil, they're at a huge disadvantage because a state-owned oil company from China or Russia, they can do things that privately owned companies can't. They can offer to build a manufacturing facility in return for access to oil and gas. Or in many cases, and this is true for China, they can offer small arms, they can offer military aircraft, they can offer all kinds of things that, again, our countries can't do, but yet they do that as a strategic imperative to get access to oil and gas. That's what our companies are up against, the companies that we rely on to bring the gasoline, the diesel, and the jet fuel to us every day. They're not big oil, they're small fish in a big pond, and that's one of the main reasons why the shale revolution in this country has started to transform the geopolitical nature of this world, because now all of a sudden they have access in their backyards to vast amounts of oil and gas reserves that right now they have an advantage because they're the incumbent operators. It's not to say that we keep out foreign investors, quite the contrary. More and more foreign investors are coming here trying to take advantage of it. But this is, just keep this in mind next time you hear the term big oil. And then anyone familiar with the old Price is Right knows that, you know, Bob Barker's public service announcement was about, you know, spay and neuter your pets. Well, this is my public service announcement, because I don't care how old you are, whether you're 5 or whether you're 95 and you've been teaching civics for the last 50 years, we've all grown up or been indoctrinated to some extent that the United States is a very energy poor country, that we don't have the resources, that we're gluttons, we consume a lot more than our peers around the world, and frankly, we need to do something about that. And so our policies reflect that mindset. Our federal policies reflect an energy scarcity. This is the reality. If you look at technically recoverable resources, which means the geologists have gone out there and they've, you know, done their drilling and their sampling, and they can say these resources are here. And then the engineers have come in and said, not only are they there, but we can get them out of the ground efficiently. Really, the only question is whether or not it's economical given the commodity prices at any given time. We've got over 100 years of natural gas, 200 years of oil, and almost 500 years of coal. Now, if you take it one step further to in-place resources, that's where the geologists have gone out and said the resource is here, but the engineering hasn't quite caught up yet. They're not able to say we can, to a degree of certainty, pull this out of the ground efficiently and economically. We've got almost 600 years of natural gas, over 500 years of oil, and almost 10,000 years of coal. That's not a misprint, 10,000 years. We have the largest energy resource base in the world. Nobody compares to what we have as far as our overall energy resources. But our mindset is still stuck in 1973 on the verge or the aftermath of the Arab oil embargo, where we thought we don't have any of this stuff and we need to conserve. So we have vast amounts of federal lands in Colorado and throughout the West, as well as offshore, off limits. We prevent exports of any sort of energy commodity, whether it's oil, gas, or coal, because we're still in this mindset of 40 years ago. But this is the reality. And it's going to take time to re-educate our members of Congress. It may not be a surprise to you, but they're kind of slow learners. And hopefully, over the next few years, our policies will start to reflect the reality that we have massive amounts of energy, and we need to be able to utilize this strategically. Now, you hear a lot of talk, especially in DC, about who gets credit for this oil and gas, this unconventional resurgence. Well, the reality is the federal government actually does deserve some credit, because they've made access to federal lands over the years so difficult, so laborious, and so costly. Frankly, it pushed a lot of the oil and gas companies off of federal lands and onto private lands. And that has encouraged a larger part of the bonanza that we've seen now. And in a very perverse sense, we can also thank OPEC, because if they were a cartel that truly knew how to operate a cartel efficiently, they would have kept prices low enough that there was no incentive for the oil and gas folks 20 years ago to start investing in some really crazy technologies that their shareholders didn't even want to see them looking at, but led to this revolution 20 years later. It's really the federal government who's helped enable that in a backwards way. But this is the reality of what it's like to operate on federal lands now. You can see historically, going back, 5 years, that it's been a significant drop-off in the number of permits issued on federal lands. Now, a lot of people say, well, hey, that's great. Who cares? We've got all this private lands going on. Well, the reality is those are lands that's oil and gas that you and I own. Every American owns. This isn't some sort of, ownership by some state. This isn't the crown like it is in the UK or elsewhere around the world. I mean, we own that, and we could be accessing that, creating jobs in Colorado, creating revenue in Colorado, and frankly, helping around the world to destabilize a lot of bad nations. I'm going to talk a lot about this now, but about a year and a half ago, we did what is still the only national study that looked at solely the macroeconomic development or contribution of the shale revolution across the entire country. And we look at it not just how much is being generated from going out and drilling holes in the ground. We follow the oil or gas molecule all the way through the economy. So the amount of money and tax revenue and jobs that are created pulling it out of the ground, following it through the midstream to get it from point A to point B, then ultimately the downstream, the folks who are ultimately buying that stuff, the end users, the refiners and the petrochemical facilities that are taking those molecules and turning them into the products that we use every single day. And what we found, at least just on the extraction side, don't look at the 2012 number because it's already dated, but at the time, this was done by IHS, a good local Colorado company, and also one of the most well-respected modeling firms in the world. What they found was that in 2012, 78,000 jobs were supported by just unconventional. We're putting the conventional stuff, which Colorado still has a lot of, not talking about that here, just the unconventional stuff. And if you look what's happened in the last 2 years, this number's been blown away. But if you look forward, going forward into 2020, we're looking at about 50,000 jobs being created just from the unconventional side. And perhaps the most important part of these statistics is the government revenue that comes in. I mean, again, if you just isolate unconventional oil and gas development, $1.4 billion 2 years ago coming at the state and local level. There's about $1.5 billion coming from Colorado to the federal government as well, but just the state level, $1.4 billion. So you and I might go and wash our Levi's on a Sunday night, and as we're getting ready to put it in the washer, we check the pockets, and we find a $20 bill, and think, man, this is my lucky day. I had no idea that was there. Well, your state and local government found a $1.4 billion bill in its pocket, because 2 years ago, there was no projections for this whatsoever. The budget writers were not expecting this kind of revenue. This has been a windfall, a largesse to this state, in order for the state to provide all the things that you and the rest of Coloradans expect. Things like education, first responders, transportation, infrastructure. And if you look out, going through 2035, what IHS projects is it would be $63 billion total. I mean, that's a lot of money even in DC. And that's meant to be a joke because we kind of treat money like, drunken sailors do. But $63 billion over a 20-year period, that's a lot of money. And again, that's all going to things that Coloradans expect their state government to provide. Now, this isn't just about the extraction. This isn't just about the drilling. Although we see the focus of that here and frankly around the country, because the drilling is what I see as the first domino in a multi-series of dominoes that are going to fall that all lead to a huge macroeconomic boom. And you can see sort of what's driving that. This is demand for natural gas, the government's projections, as far as what sector it's going into. And you see going forward, the industrial sector continues to lead. And that industrial sector is largely heavy manufacturing, petrochemicals, and refining. You see power going way up too. And frankly speaking, if these greenhouse gas rules go into effect, it'll probably actually outstrip demand as there's a push to get more and more electricity from gas than there is from coal. But the point is that right now, industrial demand is driving this renaissance. I mean, yes, at the end of the day, it's about price. If an operator sees that they can pull a unit of a barrel of oil or an MCF of gas out of the ground profitably, they're going to do that. But what supports that price is the demand. And we're seeing more and more of that demand onshoring, reshoring, or developing itself in this country, and this is largely why. This is part of our the same study that I referred to, and this shows the projections for development in the manufacturing sector over the next 10, 15 years. And you see that it's all across the board: iron and steel, chemicals, plastics and rubber, agricultural chemicals, and even machinery. I mean, we've seen in a place like Ohio, that's in the heart of the Rust Belt, we've seen 4 different steel mills that have been shuttered for up to 20 years reopened in the last 2 years. Not only that, but a French company investing $1.5 billion to build a new one. And that, at least initially, is just to produce that tubular steel, those pipes that the oil and gas industry is using to get the stuff out of the ground and to market. But now, as we start to see the people who are using the oil and gas that's coming out of the ground, we're seeing even larger increases in demand for steel because they're building things here. They're building new facilities. And ultimately, what our study found was that between now and 2020, we expect about $120 billion to be invested in the petrochemical sector. Now, I'll be honest. I mean, that sector doesn't have a big footprint in the state yet. What remains to be seen what happens going forward. A lot of it is in the Gulf. A lot of it is in the Mid-Atlantic. Most of it is in the Gulf, in Louisiana and Texas. And even though you can't see it, it matters a whole lot to the state because they're the ones who are buying all the great stuff that's coming out of the ground here in the DJ Basin. Whether it be ethane or butane, the natural gas liquids are driving this renaissance. I mean, I'm not a chemical engineer, but at the end of the day, ethane especially is the primary building block that goes into all of the plastics and resins that go into the products that make up 80% of the stuff on the shelves of Walmart that you and I might go buy, whether it's a TV set or whether it's a non-100% cotton shirt. And ultimately, it starts as molecules that come out of the ground. And here, this chart is exactly why this renaissance is happening in this country. And that's because it's significantly cheaper for us to produce the ethylene, which is what goes into the plastics and resins, than it is anywhere else in the world. You can see in this chart what it shows is that in the US, the third line from the third bar from the right, that's what it costs for us to produce a ton of ethylene. Now you compare that, it's about $300. You compare that to Europe and Asia, they're up around the $900 and $1,000 range. So the single most expensive input that goes into that sector, cost of the feedstocks, ethylene, is a third of the price here than it is in Europe or it is in Asia. Now, 10 years ago, we collectively as a country wrote off manufacturing. Basically said, you know what, that was a vestige of post-World War II. It's not part of the United States anymore. We're a service economy and we're a technology economy and we just have to let it go. Well, if you look at why that happened, it was because first and foremost, we had the most expensive natural gas in the world. Secondly, we had the most expensive labor wages in the world. And third, we had arguably the most onerous regulatory environment in the world. Now you fast forward 10 years later after we lost somewhere in the neighborhood of 1 million manufacturing jobs, predominantly from the petrochemical and refining sector, everything's been turned on its head. And primarily because we now have some of the most cheap natural gas in the entire world. I mean, frankly speaking, Qatar is the only country that produces it cheaper. And that's because they have more than they know what to do with. They can go poke a stick in the ground and the gas comes out. Now, it's not quite that easy here, but because of the unconventional revolution, it has brought the price down, much to the chagrin of the producers, but it's brought the price down to a level that the people who buy large amounts of it, the petrochemical sector, are flocking to come back here. And this is exactly why, because it's a huge competitive advantage over their rivals in Europe and in Asia. Now, we haven't really lowered our wages at all. I mean, the world has all suffered under the same economic recession that we did. But in the meantime, the countries that we're sort of strategically competing against have had to raise their wages as they become more adept at producing technologically advanced products. Countries like China and India have had no choice but to raise their wages. So we haven't lowered ours, but the gap has narrowed. Now, I can't say that our regulatory system has gotten any better, but because of that cheap natural gas and because of the narrowing of the wage rate, we're seeing this influx of money into this sector. And again, you can't really see it on the horizon here, but these are the folks who are buying all the stuff that's coming out of here. And so as long as that demand keeps up and we see these folks coming from around the world to build stuff here, it means there's still going to be jobs here pulling it out of the ground. And to just make one anecdote that's in our report, this is how extremely advantaged it's gotten. A company that produces methanol, which is one of the feedstocks that goes into fertilizers that a lot is used in this area in the agricultural sector, had built a brand new multi-billion-dollar facility in Argentina about 6 years ago. Now, 2 years ago, they moved that whole facility brick by brick to Louisiana because the economics had changed so drastically that it made no sense to continue to operate in South America when stuff was so cheap here. That's how much this has changed. Now, if you look at the entire upstream, midstream, and downstream, so the drilling, the pipes, and the barges and the trains, as well as all this manufacturing that's being generated, what we found was in 2012, 2.1 million jobs across the country existed solely because of the unconventional boom here. And going out through 2025, 3.8 billion jobs. Now, petrochemical is sort of a, I don't know, it's not an industry that most people are that familiar with, and it's, unless you live in the Gulf Coast, it's kind of at arm's length. But as they start to benefit and they start to boom, because of the cheap input costs, they're able to sell the goods that they make, those resin pellets and those plastic pellets and those chemicals that traditional manufacturers that we all think of, the sort of Acme Inc. in the middle of Michigan or Ohio somewhere that makes widgets, they're able to sell the products that those manufacturers depend on to them even more cheaply because they're undercutting their global competition because their feedstocks are so cheap. The bottom line is that's the final domino to fall, that once all this petrochemical development happens, then the traditional manufacturing really takes off circa 2020. And so all of those obituaries about US manufacturing were very premature, and we're on the precipice of being the #1 manufacturing country again after a long time off. And going back to government revenue, $1.6 trillion, national and state. This is what we project that just this unconventional boom is going to develop between now and 2025. So even in DC, that's a tremendous amount of money. I mean, we just passed a stimulus that was perhaps one of the most contentious pieces of legislation in 2009 ever. That was $800 billion. This is double that size. And again, nobody in Washington was expecting, or frankly is expecting this money to come in, because this has all kind of happened, out of the reach of normal society for the most part. When the internet really took off, everybody touched it. We saw it in our living rooms every day. But unless you live in Weld County or Larimer County or West Texas or North Dakota, you don't see the upstream boom that is happening right now. I'm fortunate enough to travel all around the country and see it, and see the local communities like Loveland and Greeley and Fort Collins benefit because of that. But the vast majority of Americans don't see that because they don't have drilling rigs next door or across the street or 2 counties over. And so this is happening in a way that most people in DC and frankly around the country are still catching on to. Now, one of the probably most notable statistics that came out of our study was IHS went back to 2005, sort of at the depths of our offshoring and manufacturing withering in this country. And then they looked at what the projections were at that point in time to where we would be right now and into 2020, and they compared it to reality. Reality includes the unconventional revolution. 2005, no one was projecting that. 2005, we were projecting building dozens and dozens of gas import facilities around the country because we were running out of gas. We were bleeding manufacturing jobs, and we needed to find a way to get more gas. If you import that stuff, it's exponentially more expensive than producing yourself because just the transportation costs alone sometimes can be as much as the cost of the gas itself. Point is, they compared the path that we were on in 2005 to the path where we ended up, and what they found is in 2012, if you divide it across the entire country by household, it was the equivalent of each household having $1,200 of disposable income. Now, it's not the same thing as you and I walking to our mailbox and pulling a $1,200 check out, but it's very real, because but for this happening, we would have had $1,200 less in our pocket, because we would have been paying that much more, certainly for our energy, whether it's our electricity bill or our gasoline bills. But then when you take into account the cost of energy as they fluctuate through the entire economy, the cost of transporting goods, the cost of making goods, that's a lot. And $1,200 is very real. This is how everyone around the country is benefiting directly. Some states, like Colorado, are benefiting more directly, but this is an average across the entire country. And you go all the way out to 2025, we have it up to about $3,500. Again, money that would have otherwise been going to the same goods, now it doesn't have to because of this unconventional revolution. And if you look at what happened over the course of the Great Recession, this was the golden goose. But for the oil and gas revolution, we would literally still be in a recession. And the economists can argue we may very well still be in a recession. They'll figure that out 10 years from now, because that's how economics works. But the reality is, if you look over the course of the Great Recession, 2007, 2012, leading up to it, and you look at job creation, you see across the entire economy, that red line, job economy slowed and lost 2.6%. Obviously, unemployment was a huge issue 3 and 4 years. In some parts of the country, it still is. But if you pull out the oil and gas sector over that same period of time, it created 38.6% of the jobs. I'm sorry, it increased by 38.6%. So again, if that didn't happen, if that boom didn't happen, we would have saw unemployment rates north of 13%. And Lord knows, when we see economic growth like we did last quarter at 0% or maybe 0.1, depending upon who you listen to, we would still be in a recession, and probably a much deeper recession, but for this happening. And this is one of the reasons why I would argue, and a lot of my members in the oil and gas industry don't necessarily appreciate when I say this, but this is one of the reasons why this administration has treated oil and gas development arguably with kid gloves, which is to say that there are a lot of folks in the environmental community that are very important to this administration who wanted to see much more severe environmental restrictions across the board. But at the same time, the White House knew that if this goes away, our economy is a wreck. And so we need to do what we can to ensure that this economic growth still happens while maintaining the environmental standards that we all demand. And lo and behold, we've done that. Now, talk a little bit geopolitical and energy security from our standpoint. This is a very convoluted chart, and I'm going to explain it, but ultimately what it shows is that we're importing a whole lot less oil now than we used to. The blue part of this chart represents domestic production of oil going all the way back to 1960. And you see that right about 1971, we peaked. And ever since 1971, every year we produced less than the year before, up to about 2006. You see that gradual decline. In 2006, we were importing 2/3 of all of our oil. It was the highest it had ever been. Now, that orange stuff, that's Canadian imports. You see that the orange stuff really came online especially big in the mid to late 1990s. And that's when the Albertan oil sands started to become productive, and they started exporting it to us. We were, and still are, the only market that Canada delivers that to. Although, you may have heard of a little thing called the Keystone XL pipeline that, this administration can't decide after 5 years whether it wants to build it or not. The Canadians have no choice but to look for other places to send it. But we're finding ways to get it here, other pipelines, rail, barge, so forth. And you see that in this projection, it continues to grow going forward to the right of that green line. So the blue is growing exponentially to the right of the green line. That's us producing more and more here. We're importing more and more Canadian oil. You may wonder, well, if we're producing more stuff here, why are we importing more? It's not the same type of oil. The stuff that's coming out of the ground here, light sweet crude, it's kind of the Dom Perignon of oil. I mean, it's very pure, and you can do a lot more things with it. But our refineries, because of the astuteness and the technological ingenuity of our engineers, our refineries, especially in the Gulf Coast, rely on really the sort of Budweiser of oil, the heavy crude, because it's cheaper, and so they can reduce their input costs by buying cheaper oil, but still make the same gasoline products that we depend on. So we don't really produce a lot of that heavy crude, the Budweiser, so we still need to import it. But the bottom line is, you see that domestic production is growing exponentially. Imports of Canadian oil continue to grow. So where does that leave us? That leaves us with a lot less overseas imports, and that's the black stuff. As you see going forward to the right, it gets smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. And at this point, we're down to about 40% of all of our imports are coming from abroad. And if you back the Canadian part out of that, the overseas imports, it's about 20%. And this projection has it going to about 5%, which is pretty incredible considering, again, in 2006, we were importing 2/3 of all of our oil. Now, oil is a global commodity. It's fungible. And just because we're producing here doesn't mean that we're completely immune to what happens around the world. But if you look at how tumultuous the Middle East has been over the last 3 or 4 years, and you look at how stable ultimately our gasoline prices, because that's how most Americans measure energy security, our prices have been more stable than they have been any time in the last 20 years, in spite of what's happening in Iraq, in Syria, in Iran, in Egypt, and especially in Libya, major oil producers. And to wit, one point, I think everyone's sort of familiar with at least generally what's happening in Iran. You have a country that is trying to develop its own nuclear technology arguably to make weapons. And nobody in the free world wants that to happen. And so there was a major push about 3 or 4 years ago, led by the US, President Obama and Secretary of State Clinton going around the world encouraging other nations to say, don't buy their oil. Let's essentially embargo it. Because if they can't sell their oil, their economy withers on the vine, because that's where they get all of their money from. And, as you can imagine, most countries are very receptive to that. Yep, we don't think we want nuclear weapons in the hands of the Iranians. But like you, US, we rely on oil to fuel our economy. So we can't just say no to oil because we don't have an alternative. Well, at the same time is when this unconventional boom was really taking off in this country. And ironically, the growth in production domestically in this country between 2006 and 2010, when they were going around asking for this, was about 1.8 million barrels. What was Iran's exports that year? 1.8 million barrels. Point is we were buying 1.8 million less barrels off the world market. That means other countries, whether it's Japan or France or Australia, whoever it may be, could now continue to purchase the same amount of oil they wanted, but they didn't have to buy it from Iran. They were buying it from the people that we would have otherwise bought it from. We wouldn't have been able to influence Iranian policy and forcing them back to the negotiation table but for this unconventional revolution, because it enabled us to empower the rest of the world to say no to Iranian oil. And I mean, this is a chart about North Dakota, but you see it out here in the DJ Basin more than anywhere. The production here, not only is it growing exponentially, but it's becoming much more efficient. Traditionally, the way you measure sort of the health of the oil industry is how many rigs are in the field. Rigs go up, that means things are going well. Rigs go down, things are going bad. Well, this kind of got turned on its head about 1.5 years, 2 years ago. There's arguments who did it first, and there always will be, but initially in North Dakota, and now we certainly see it out here, you see the blue line, that's production. The green line is the number of rigs in the field. You see that right about the latter part of 2012, the number of rigs drops off exponentially overnight. But yet production continues to rise. And that's because this industry innovated around certain issues. In this case, it was, hey, why don't we drill multiple holes from the same pad? You go out to the Piceance, and you've got some well pads, they have 20, 25 wells in them. 10 years ago, 5 years ago, it would have been 1 well. Even out here in the DJ Basin, I've been on well pads that have 6 and 7 wells. Normally, those would be 6 or 7 wells scattered over many, many acres, meaning 6 or 7 times that industry has to come in with their trucks and pipes and disrupt the local community. Now they can do it once, 1/8, 1/7, 1/4 of the time. And this efficiency has certainly benefited the local communities, but it also has benefited the industry, and it's benefited the country by ensuring that we're producing more and more of this oil and gas with less of an impact. Now, not only are we using more and more of the liquids that I was talking about that are driving this manufacturing renaissance, but we're producing more of it than we can use. So now we're looking to export this stuff. We're exporting more and more of it every day, and you see this chart of all the major petrochemical feedstocks, polyethylene, polypropylene, and vinyls. You see a projection for massive increases going forward. This is helping our trade deficit. I mean, we're already importing less oil. We're on the verge of being able to export some, and we're looking to export gas if and when the federal government essentially allows us to do it. Incrementally, they're doing that right now. But these liquids are unrestrained. We can export them anytime we want. So we're seeing a massive investment, especially in the Gulf Coast, to export the stuff that's coming out of the ground here. Because ultimately what happens, we've seen what happens with gas. And certainly the West Slope has been a poster child for what happens when the market gluts. Industry became a victim of its own success. We're able to get it out of the ground efficiently and cost effectively to the point where we were producing more than we could consume. What happens then? The price plummets. And then all of a sudden it's not economical to pull some of it out of the ground anymore. Well, we've done that with the liquids now, and we're on the verge of doing that with crude. We're about, no one can say precisely when, it could be tomorrow, it could be a year from now, but we're about to produce one more barrel of crude than we can consume. And that's partially because all of these things are constrained. The exports are constrained. The one exception are the liquids. And we're pulling a lot of liquids, the natural gas liquids, out of the ground here, out in the DJ Basin and throughout Colorado. And the more we're able to export this stuff, then the more the demand keeps up, the more that we're able to keep building the upstream industry in this part of the state. The midstream, that second domino, we've seen somewhere in the neighborhood, and midstream basically is the pipes, the rail cars, the barges, anything that is used to take those molecules from a wellhead out here in Greeley to wherever it's going. We've seen upwards of $60 billion invested in the last 5 years building that out. And right now, those petrochemical investments are just waiting for this to get built out. Once there's a pathway to get it from point A to point B, we're all in. But, we just don't have the infrastructure necessary right now, although we're catching up quickly, because we're producing this stuff in areas that we never produced it before. North Dakota used to be like the 32nd largest producing state in the country. Now they're the second largest. We don't have the infrastructure to bring as much of the oil that they're producing down to market. This part of Colorado used to be a drop in the bucket. The West Slope was the producing area. Now, been turned on its head. So we have a lot more oil and gas liquids coming out of the ground here than ever before. We need more and more pipes and more infrastructure to bring it to market. That's being built out, like I said, upwards of $60 billion over the last couple of years. And then if you look how it's getting from market, you see that rail, barge, and truck has all grown exponentially. The point is that industry's not waiting for these pipes to get built. And in some cases, they're shrugging their shoulders and saying, you know what, we don't necessarily even need a pipe because we can move it effectively, efficiently, and safely with rail, barge, or truck. And so we've seen it double in the last 2 years, shipments in those non-pipe formats. And then I guess it would be imperative to not talk about this. This is all great. This is all wonderful, from a macroeconomic standpoint. But it's not a sure thing, and we can still screw this up. Certainly, Coloradans know this better than anyone as we move into November, and we may very well be voting on one or more initiatives. But what we had IHS do when they did our report was look at what would happen if a few different regulations were put in place to really curb the unconventional development. And we didn't cherry pick. We went to the Department of Energy, and the Secretary of Energy has an advisory board. It's an official mechanism of the US government. And they had provided a list of different items, or different actions that, if taken, could really muck things up. So we didn't cherry pick. We took their list, and we asked IHS what would happen if these things happen. A different set of regulations across the board. And what they found was by 2015, we'd have 1.5 million less jobs than the path that we're on. We'd see government revenue decrease by over $500 billion between now and 2025. That's real money, and that's money that we're going to leave in the ground, leave in somewhere else, not here, if we don't ensure that this revolution continues to take place. Okay. This is what is happening across the country. Coloradans, you guys aren't alone. You're not the only ones dealing with this at a state and local level. Right now, and I defer to my friends at Food and Water Watch, over 423 actions have been taken in 21 states, and Hawaii is included in there, but it was too hard to get it on the map. So these are actions that have been taken at the local level. Now, a lot of these, one might take feckless. The state of Vermont passes a moratorium on oil and gas development. Who cares? They don't have any oil and gas. It doesn't matter. But we've started to see the people who want to keep these resources in the ground become more and more effective. I mean, obviously in this state, we've seen 5 different local measures, with great success if you're trying to keep it in the ground. And going into November, we're going to see the ultimate test. And if we're not careful, it goes away. And Coloradans are very unique. I mean, if you look at sort of the polling around here, unlike when I do this in West Virginia or Ohio or Pennsylvania, a large swath of Coloradans don't think this industry is necessary. That we're not willing to sacrifice our health and our environment for a few jobs. And who is? But I think a lot of folks here don't appreciate how big this is to the economy. The oil and gas industry accounts for 5% of Colorado's GDP, and correspondingly also accounts for 5% of all the employment. Now, 5% may sound big or small to you, depending upon how you look at this economically. But the reality is, if one of these initiatives were to pass and were to literally put Colorado out of business overnight, you lose 5% of your GDP. That causes some pretty major follow-on effects. And that's not the kind of hit that an economy recovers from overnight. That's the kind of hit that sometimes takes decades to recover from. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't use a few of my last minutes to jump out of the oil patch and talk a little bit about the electricity sector. Because while a lot of things are going really, really well on the oil and gas side, a lot of things are changing very quickly, and in some ways in a very economically destructive way on the utility side. This is a chart that I did about, say, 2 years ago. I quit updating because it was too difficult, but it's a graphical depiction of all of the air and water regulations that utilities are facing over the next few years. Some of them are already in place, some of them are coming. Now, we all want clean air, no one more so than Coloradans. I'm a Californian. A lot of my brethren have fled to the state because of that exact reason. We don't want any of that smoggy air. We want the good stuff here. Well, the fact of the matter is that the air is cleaner today than it was yesterday, and it's exponentially cleaner than it was 40 years ago when the Clean Air Act was passed. And we're down to the last 5% of mercury coming out of smokestacks of fossil-fired fuel plants. Period. 5%. We've already eliminated 95% of it. Same thing with many of the other harmful pollutants that come out of power plants. Things like soot, things like particulate matter, things like nitrogen oxide, things that hurt humans or could hurt humans. We've eliminated, like I said, upwards of 90 to 95% of them. The Clean Air Act has done a really, really good job. A lot of these are taking that sort of into overdrive. To wit, on mercury, like I said, down to that last 5%. You talk to any engineer and they will tell you the removal of that final 5% is exponentially more difficult than the first 5%, and probably exponentially more difficult than the first 50%. So the way the Clean Air Act has always worked, in its 40 years of existence, as you get closer and closer to removing whatever pollutant you're looking at, we give industry a little more time because it takes more time to engineer around that problem. It's exponentially harder. Well, what has happened is this administration has said, well, we don't really want to wait. We want to do this under our watch. And so they constrain that time. When it comes to mercury, that's having a pretty disastrous impact. Now, again, mercury is really bad. It's not something that you want to be around. But we've eliminated 95% of it. There is a narrative, and sometimes it's spread by my oil and gas members and sometimes by others, that, well, coal has been losing, and coal has been losing fair and square on the economic battlefield. Natural gas is just too cheap. Coal can't compete. Well, to some extent, there's some truth in that. But let's look at the price on an apples-to-apples basis. At no point in time has natural gas ever been cheaper than coal. It's not all about economics, but let's just be clear. Economics hasn't been the only thing that has pushed coal out. Now, coal and gas compete. They compete in the same market, the same utility market, and the same industrial consumption market. So as natural gas got cheaper and cheaper, it forced coal to get cheaper. So don't get me wrong. Economics certainly hurt coal a lot over the last few years. But this is what's hurt it even more. And if you look at going forward, that mercury rule I talked about, it goes into effect next year. Trying to get rid of that final 5%. 95% of it's already gone. And they reduced the amount of time that we're going to be able to pull it out of to eliminate it. What the government itself has estimated is that somewhere in the neighborhood of 75 gigawatts of coal will go offline. Now, you probably don't know a gigawatt from an Oreo cookie, but what that translates into is about 20% of all of our coal plants, 10% of all of our generation in this country. Why does that matter? Well, it matters because, one, we rely on this for the majority of our electricity. This state still depends on coal for upwards of 60%, fluctuating up and down a little bit, of its electricity. It's not to say that, you can't shoot for the moon and say we want to change our generation portfolio this way or that way, but it doesn't happen overnight, and this rule is forcing a lot of that to happen overnight. Now, one of the reasons why everyone loves Colorado is that even when your weather is inclement, it's still a nice place to live. Go back to January and remember that some of your neighbors to the north were suffering under the polar vortex. Temperatures are dropping to like 40 degrees in places like Michigan and Ohio. Temperatures that they weren't prepared for. Now, as you can imagine, electricity demand skyrocketed at that point in time. And it's not because you had a bunch of pasty Midwesterners wanting to sit around in their shorts, watch the Super Bowl, spin up the blender, and make margaritas. It was because if you don't have reliable heat when it drops to 40 degrees, people die. It happens in Canada, it happens in Northern Europe all the time. The elderly and the young just don't have the ability to survive in temperatures that way. I mean, Coloradans see themselves as virulent and robust people, absolutely. But nobody can do well when it's that cold. So the temperature dropped that that far, demand skyrocketed. These plants that I'm talking about are going to close, the 10% of the entire U.S. generation fleet, were operating at 95% capacity over that time frame. 95%. 2 years from now, they're going to be gone. Now, one of the problems in our regulatory system, EPA is doing what it's supposed to do. It's supposed to go after a pollutant and get rid of it. And it does a damn fine job doing that. And we should all be happy that we live in a country where that happens. The problem is, at no point in time did Congress ever instruct EPA to take into account reliability or economics. So EPA is not forced to answer the question, what happens in 2017 when the next polar vortex hits? Those plants are all closed down. They can't operate at 95% anymore. Where is the electricity going to come from? EPA doesn't frankly care because that's not its job. But that's a real world issue. And it's not just for that part of the country. This is where those closures are going to happen. You see it's primarily concentrated in the industrial Midwest, but you see a couple of those big circles here in Colorado. We've already had a couple coal plants close, and we'll have a few more. And in some ways it's good because got a lot of gas, got a lot of coal. We want flexibility. We want a state like this that is an energy producer to be able to have the flexibility of picking fuels. But we're starting to limit the choice of that flexibility. And you may think, this is great for gas. You overlay these mercury rules, you overlay on top of them the greenhouse gas rules, and certainly in the near term, it's going to drive up demand for natural gas, which is good for the folks in the West Slope who are scraping by right now with glutted gas. But the reality is, if you look at how the Clean Air Act works, this isn't one rule. This isn't one rule, the rule that the administration proposed last month. It's a series of rules over decades, and it works the same way. The same way it's worked with mercury, it doesn't stop ratcheting down until it eliminates that pollutant, in this case CO2. Last I checked, natural gas is a fossil fuel. Now, it produces about half of the CO2 that coal does when it's combusted, but there's only so much of the reductions you can get by eliminating coal. My point is, in any scenario, including the White House's, at some point around 2020, 2030, you can't be sure because who knows what's going to happen in the courts, but these rules will start to pinch on natural gas to the point where they're already asking, EPA, should we require natural gas plants to have carbon capture and storage technology? We can't even do that with coal plants yet, and they're already asking if we should do it with natural gas plants. My only point is, just because natural gas benefits over the next 10 years, don't think that this is some sort of windfall. Because if you're looking 10, 15 years out, it really starts to ratchet down on natural gas. And I can tell you with 100% certainty that the way the Clean Air Act works, can't tell you when it's going to happen, but it's an eventuality. At some point in time, we will no longer burn coal or natural gas to produce electricity. It's not me scaremongering. It's how the Clean Air Act works. It's very, very predictive. The president has been pretty clear about himself. Natural gas is a bridge fuel, meaning that over the next 20 years, we're going to use a lot of it, but then we're going to stop using it. So if you think natural gas is a good thing, just realize that it's not coal versus gas. It's coal and gas and, frankly, the economy and the entire industrial sector that is going to suffer because of this. Now, why is this being done? Well, for climate change purposes. So you say, great. Well, what if we meet the targets that the president just laid out? What if we were able to reduce our rate of emissions by 30% by 2030? Based on government's own projections of where emissions will be in 2030, that will net a reduction of about 1.4% globally. Because globally is all that matters. Unlike mercury, where if you're next to where it's coming from, it hurts you, CO2, it doesn't matter where it's coming from. It could be coming from South Africa, or from Canada, or from Denver. It all has the same impact as far as concentrations in the atmosphere. So if we act alone, nothing happens. So the administration says, rightfully, we're leading. We need to take the first step because we are a leader and the rest of the world will follow. Well, go back to my first slide. 1.6 billion people without power. The rest of the world is not going to follow. They haven't followed to date, nor will they, because they're more concerned about keeping those people alive. The best way to keep those people alive is to get them power. That means more coal. That means more gas. That means the things that the fuels that we know that we can rely on that are efficient and cheap. So those rest of the world isn't gonna follow. China is the largest emitter, and yes, they acknowledge they have a major air problem. But let's distinguish between pollutants that cause health damage and that are linked to global warming. Things like mercury, like I said, they hurt you. Things like particulate matter, which is one of the reasons why you can't see more than 5 blocks in Beijing sometimes, they hurt you. And so China is very much trying to address those pollutants. When it comes to CO2, it doesn't hurt you. It doesn't hurt any of us. From a physiological standpoint, they're not trying to curb CO2 because it hurts health, human health, they're trying to do it because it has the impacts on the environment. So my only point is, they're trying to lead, the rest of the world is not going to follow. And what that means is we're betting our entire economic future on hopefully an engineering change. Now, I'm never going to bet against US engineers. I mean, they've ruled the world for many years as far as advancing technology, both here and abroad. But I'm not sure that we're at a point where we really want to bet the entire economy on it. And again, it's not hyperbolic. That's what we're doing. Without a technological revolution, we're saying no more coal, no more gas. And I must ask, where do we get it from? Renewables play a very important part, but renewables are still intermittent, meaning that they're not baseload. They don't run 24/7. And right now, this administration is reducing the amount of money that goes into storing the electricity they produce when their demand isn't there. I mean, that's the one sort of technological breakthrough that can bring renewables on par with coal, gas, and nuclear. So, I mean, it's a conundrum. We don't really have a path forward. We know that we're trying to eliminate CO2, but we don't know what's going to replace the stuff that burns the CO2. It's a big question, and it's something that we need to be asking our elected officials. They need to take this pretty seriously. So with that, I think we might have a minute or two for a question.
Who has questions?
Or less.
None?
All right.
How about a round of applause for Christopher?